I've heard the term active listening, but I'm not really clear about what it is.
Okay, well, a lot of the time when we listen, we have so many other things going on in our minds, and we're not always giving the other person the full attention that really we ought to be giving, particularly when we're guiding them to be solving problems and identifying their own solutions. And so active listening, the term, conveys this idea that we've got to really be giving our full attention into listening to what the other person's saying. Now, what does full attention mean? Well, the model I use puts active listening into a quadrant, and each of the quadrants has a particular meaning, which when you take it all together forms a process for really being able to listen actively. Let's talk for a minute about each one of those quadrants.
Yeah. Can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
I'm nodding in response to you. Is that showing that I'm actively listening? If I didn't nod, or if I just looked at you, would you think I wasn't actively listening to you?
You have picked up on what is actually one of the key elements to active listening, because absolutely, the nodding and the eye contact is tremendously important, and actually it begins in the first quadrant.
Oh, right.
So you've taken me very nicely into that first quadrant, which is being there, the actual physical presence that you need. So let me ask you, what else do you think is involved in the physical presence of being in the meeting?
Well, it's obviously body language, if people are leaning forward or leaning back or folding their arms. So there's body language is another area.
Body language is very, very important. I mean, it's interesting the one you pick up on folding your arms, because a lot of people think that that's a negative thing to do. In fact, if you look into, experts at analysing body language, quite often people are folding their arms because it's comfortable. And in fact, if you think about it, it's quite a comfortable way of sitting. So the advice really is not to read too much into somebody's, if they're sitting with their arms crossed. But other than that, you're absolutely right. Body language is key. Now, part of all of this is also sitting, how people are sitting together. So what would you do? Let's say we're walking, let's do it. We both stand up and we walk into the room to start the coaching conversation. Where would you expect coach and learner to sit?
I'd expect them to sit opposite each other.
Well, let's just try that for a minute. Because one of the problems about sitting opposite one another is that it can feel very, very confrontational.
It's really interesting you say that, because having moved from there to there, I felt much more threatened.
Exactly.
It's really interesting. I hadn't realised that.
Exactly. Now, of course, we often in restaurants sit opposite one another, but that's a whole different story, because of course that's an intimacy. Again, something absolutely to be avoided in a coaching situation. And the advantage of sitting at right angles to one another, as indeed we are, is that it means that when you're talking, you can very naturally move your glance, but then that way you're not having that intimidating eye contact going on all the time.
Yeah.
Now, what happens if you're the listener? What do you do then about your eye contact?
Well, I think it's important to maintain that contact when people are talking to you, to show that you are listening.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's critical, because of course as the listener, if you look away, when the person who's speaking, they turn back to look at you, if you're not looking at them and not keeping the eye contact going, it makes them think that you're not interested, that you're not really there in the conversation.
So active listening is that being there with them in the moment.
That's right. But of course there's more to it, because what we've talked about so far is one of the quadrants. It's the first.
Oh, right.
But the second quadrant is about asking questions. It's about drawing out information from the other person. It's also vitally important that we suspend judgment. Quite often when we're in a conversation, we hear somebody say something and that might trigger a thought for us, or we might feel a bit tempted to say, oh, I had that experience, or that happened to me. Or, I mean, these are you putting your judgment onto what the person is saying, and that is to be avoided. So the second quadrant is about asking the question to draw the other person out. Questioning techniques are vitally important, and we go into these a great deal in this module. Suspending judgment is the third. I've given it a quadrant all on its own because it is so important to the whole interaction. And then the final one is to reflect back and check understanding. You know, sometimes we know what we mean, but we may have actually not quite said it in that way. Or anyway, there's always a margin of error in how the other person is receiving and understanding what we're saying. And so just checking and summarising is something to do at various points in the conversation, and certainly at the end of the conversation.
Certainly in chairing meetings, I always say, right, this is what we've agreed, and these are who are taking the actions, because I find that that's another way of making sure that you've checked for understanding.
Yes, vitally important.
Yes.
Absolutely the thing to do.
Yeah.